The gun went off before Catherine Sutton even understood what was happening. One moment she was kneeling at the river's edge, washing the trail dust from her face in the last copper light of a New Mexico evening, and the next, a shot cracked the air like a whip against dry wood, and a man named Dahlen Vetch was screaming at her from 15 feet away that she had no business being alive on this drive, let alone finishing it. She did not flinch. That was the thing that struck Emmett Ralston dumb where he stood. Every other man within earshot had either dropped or reached for iron, but Catherine Sutton rose slowly from her crouch at the river, water still dripping from her chin, and turned to face Vetch with the stillness of someone who had long ago made peace with the idea that the world would try to break her and had simply decided it would not. "You missed," she said. Her voice was level. Not brave, not defiant, just flat and certain, the way a woman speaks when she has been threatened so many times that being threatened no longer costs her anything. Vetch raised the pistol again. He was drunk and red-faced and furious in the way that small men become furious when something quietly refuses to be small for them. "You think this is a game, woman? You think Garland Macready hired you on so you could show the rest of us up? You've been pulling the same weight as the hands for 2 weeks, and now every man on this drive looks like a fool next to you." Emmett stepped out from behind the wagon. He did not draw. He put himself between the gun and Catherine, and he stood there the way a wall stands, not threatening, just present and immovable, and he said, "Put it down, Dahlen." And Vetch, who was drunk but not stupid, looked at Emmett Ralston's face and lowered the gun. That was the night everything changed. But to understand what brought them all to that riverbank, to that moment of hidden fury and barely contained violence, you have to go back 17 days, to the morning a woman nobody expected rode into the staging camp outside of Santa Fe and asked for a job. The year was 1873, and the cattle trade was alive and brutal and magnificent. The great good-night-loving trail had already carved its legend into the red earth, and the men who drove herds north from the New Mexico territory toward the railheads in Colorado were hard and experienced and deeply skeptical of anything that interrupted the machinery of their work. Garland Macready ran a respectable operation. He had 700 head of mixed longhorns he needed to move 340 miles north to Pueblo, where a buyer named Hargrove was waiting with signed contracts and money. Macready had 16 hands, a cook named Old Petey who was 63 and missing 2 fingers, and one trail boss he trusted with his life. That trail boss was Emmett Ralston. Emmett was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders and lean everywhere else, with dark eyes that cataloged everything and gave very little back. He had been driving cattle since he was 16, had survived a Comanche raid outside of Lubbock, a flash flood in the Pecos lowlands, and 3 separate incidents of trail hand mutiny, none of which he spoke about. He was not a man given to unnecessary words, and he was not a man given to sentiment, but he was scrupulously fair, which in the trail-driving world of 1873 was rarer and more valuable than either quality alone. When Catherine Sutton rode into camp that morning, Emmett was checking the condition of the lead steers. He heard the commotion before he saw the cause of it. Men stopping their work, voices rising in something between amusement and disbelief. He walked around the flank of a roan steer and saw her. She was on a dark bay mare, sitting the saddle straight without being rigid, the kind of rider who had spent so many years on horseback that the horse was simply an extension of her body. She was 26 years old, with dark chestnut hair pinned under a wide-brimmed hat and gray eyes that took in the camp with quick, practical intelligence. She wore a canvas duster over work clothes, had a bedroll lashed to the back of her saddle, and was carrying a coiled rope on her horn the way a working hand carries one, not as decoration but within easy reach. She was asking for Macready. The men were laughing. Emmett watched as she waited out the laughter with the patience of someone who had decided long ago not to spend energy on things she could not change. She did not flush. She did not argue. She simply sat her horse and waited, and when Macready appeared from the supply wagon looking irritable at the disruption, she addressed him directly and without preamble. "Mr. Macready, my name is Catherine Sutton. I understand you are a hand short since Chester Greer broke his leg in Albuquerque last week. I am applying for that position." Macready stared at her. Several of the hands were openly grinning. "Ma'am," Macready said, in the careful tone of a man who does not want to be rude but is very certain of what he is about to say, "this is a cattle drive." "I am aware of that," Catherine said. "I grew up on a working ranch outside of Cimarron. My father ran 1,100 head of cattle until he died 4 years ago. I have driven cattle to the railhead twice, both times with my father's outfit. I can rope, I can cut, I can night herd, and I can shoe a horse. I ask only for the same wage as your other hands and the same treatment." "Same treatment," Macready repeated. "The same expectations and the same respect," she said, and her voice had that flat certainty in it again. "I do not ask for special accommodation." Macready looked at Emmett. Emmett walked forward because Macready looking at him was an invitation for his opinion, and his opinion was what he gave. He stopped in front of Catherine's horse and looked up at her, and she looked down at him, and there was a moment between them that was brief and electrically direct, an assessment going both ways simultaneously. "You said Cimarron," Emmett said. "Yes. You know the Cimarron cutoff." "I have ridden it in both directions." He nodded once slowly. "Can you handle a remuda?" "I prefer to work the cattle," she said, "but yes, I can handle a remuda." He looked at Macready. "We need the hand." Macready chewed the inside of his cheek, looked at the assembled men who were still grinning, and made the calculation that a trail boss vouching for someone was worth more than his own discomfort. 2 weeks trial," he said. "You pull your weight or you go home, same as anybody." Catherine Sutton swung down from her horse with the easy movement of someone who did it 100 times a day, shook Macready's hand, and began unsaddling her mare as if she had already known the answer would be yes. The first day of the drive was April 3rd, 1873. They pushed out of Santa Fe before dawn, moving 711 head of mixed longhorn cattle north along the base of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, the air still sharp with cold and the ground still damp from late-season rain. The longhorns were fractious and full of energy after weeks in the holding pens, and the first 6 hours were controlled chaos, cattle breaking from the herd, hands shouting and cutting and riding hard to keep the mass moving in the right direction. Catherine worked the right flank. Emmett worked the point with a veteran hand named Briscoe, but he was watching the flanks the way a trail boss always watches everything, cataloging problems before they became disasters. He saw Catherine working with efficient economy, no wasted motion, no panic, using her horse well and her rope exactly when she needed it. When a young steer broke hard to the east, she was already moving before it had gone 20 feet, cutting it off and turning it back with the practiced ease of someone who had done this so many times that it was no longer thought, only reaction. He said nothing. He noted it. The first evening camp, they made 14 miles, which was good for a first day. Old Petey had beans and salt pork ready over the fire, and the hands came in tired and raw and hungry, and there was the usual ordering of the camp, the division of night herding duties, the negotiation of bedroll space around the fire. Catherine took her plate of beans and sat slightly apart from the main group, not because she was excluded exactly, but because the exclusion was implicit in every way the men arranged themselves naturally without thinking. She ate steadily and without apparent notice of the arrangement, and when the night herd assignments were given, she took her shift without comment. Dahlen Vetch was the first one to make his feelings explicit. He was a compact, sandy-haired man of 34 who had been with Macready for 3 drives, and who carried the particular resentment of someone who considers himself indispensable, and therefore takes any disruption to the established order personally. He did not say anything directly threatening that first evening. He only made a comment to the man beside him, loud enough to carry, about how the drive was going to be slowed down by having to babysit a woman and how Macready must have lost his senses. Catherine, 10 feet away, gave no indication she had heard him. She finished her beans. She rinsed her plate in the bucket. She went to her bedroll. The second day was harder. The terrain north of Santa Fe buckled and rose into broken country, arroyos cutting the land in unexpected directions, the cattle nervous and awkward on the uneven footing. Two of the younger hands, a pair of brothers named Cal and Webb Daniels, who were 20 and 22 respectively, and had been on their first drive, nearly lost 20 head into a steep-sided wash when they misjudged the approach. The cattle were already sliding down the near bank when Catherine came from nowhere at a dead gallop, drove her horse along the lip of the arroyo, and turned the leaders back with a perfectly placed loop that caught the near steer around the horns and held it just long enough for the mass behind it to compress and stop. The rope cost her. It was a new braided hemp rope, and the tension and the sudden violent jerk of 700 pounds of panicked longhorn snapped it clean at the Honda. She held the stub end. The steer scrambled back up the bank, and the crisis was over. Cal Daniels said, "Thank you, ma'am," with the wide eyes of a young man who understood he had just watched something impressive. Webb Daniels just stared. Emmett had seen it. He had been 60 yards back when it happened, moving to intervene, and she had been faster. He watched her coil the broken rope, examine the frayed end, and stuff it into her saddlebag without a word. She had lost equipment that cost her money, and she did not complain about it. She simply made a note of it and moved on. He filed it away. That evening, when the camp was making its fire and Petey was starting the coffee, Emmett went to where she had picketed her mare and was brushing the horse down methodically after the long day. "I'll replace the rope," he said. She kept brushing. "I can replace my own equipment. You lost it working Macready's cattle. That comes out of the drive supply." She paused, looked at him over the horse's back. "All right," she said after a moment. That was their first real conversation. 12 words and an acquiescence that cost her something. He could tell, because she was the kind of woman who did not like accepting things from people she did not yet trust. But she was also practical enough to accept what was fair, and he had offered it fairly. He went and got her a rope from the supply wagon. The third day was when everything shifted in Emmett Ralston's interior life, though he would not have been able to name it as such at the time. He was not a man accustomed to examining what happened inside himself with much precision. He knew cattle and weather and terrain and the management of men, and these were the things he paid attention to. He did not think of himself as someone who noticed women the way other men seemed to, with the constant undercurrent of assessment and desire that colored so much of what he observed around the fire at night. But the third day he noticed Catherine Sutton, not in the way of desire at first, in the way of recognition. It was midday, and the heat had come on hard after the cool of the morning, the kind of relentless high desert sun that bleaches color from the land and draws every drop of moisture from a person. They had been in the saddle since 4 in the morning. 2 of the hands, including the experienced Briscoe, were visibly flagging. Men were leaning in their saddles, speaking less, moving with the deliberate conservation of energy that marks a person approaching their limit. Catherine worked her flank the same as she had at 6 in the morning. She did not slow. She did not slump. She did not make any of the small, audible complaints that trail hands use as social lubrication, the muttered curses, the expressed wishes for shade or water, the collective acknowledgement that the work is brutal and they are all suffering together. She simply worked, steady and efficient, as if her fuel source was something other than what the rest of them were running on. At the noon stop, when the cattle were bunched and held and the hands dismounted and drank water in long, desperate gulps, Emmett watched her drink. She drank enough, not extravagantly, just enough, and then she checked her horse, checked the girth, checked the mare's feet for stones, and was back in the saddle before half the men had finished resting. He thought about what that meant. He thought about the dark past that made a person move through hardship as if it were simply weather, unavoidable and impersonal. Because that quality of endurance, the kind that is not bravado or performance but just the deep structural bedrock of a person, does not come from easy living. It comes from surviving something. He had seen it in certain soldiers. He had seen it in one or two old trail hands who had been through disasters that had reordered their understanding of what constituted a real problem. He had never seen it in a woman, which was not because women were less capable of it. He was self-aware enough to understand that, but simply because he had never had occasion to observe it. He had been watching her for 3 days. By the third day, he knew something he had not known on the first. Catherine Sutton was the most capable person on this drive. Not the strongest, not the fastest, but the most consistently, reliably, quietly capable. And she was going to finish this drive. Whatever it cost her, she was going to finish. He wanted to know why. He was not yet ready to admit that wanting to know why a particular person does something is the first thread of a very specific kind of caring. He told himself it was professional interest. Trail bosses needed to understand the people in their outfit. That was all. He lied to himself and found it only partially convincing. The 6th day brought a problem that had nothing to do with cattle. They had made camp in a shallow valley near a creek that ran clean and cold out of the mountains to the west. And the mood in camp was marginally better because there was water and shade, and Petey had managed to shoot a wild turkey, which was currently doing excellent things to everyone's morale on a spit over the fire. The evening had the quality of relative ease that a trail outfit settles into when a week of hard work has smoothed the edges off the initial friction, and everyone knows their place. But Emmett had noticed something he did not like, and it had a specific shape and a specific name, and that name was Dahlen Vetch. Vetch had been watching Catherine with an attention that had shifted from contemptuous to something else, something that combined resentment with a focused, proprietary interest that Emmett recognized and did not trust. Vetch had not spoken directly to her since the drive began, but he had been talking about her. Emmett heard it in the way conversations shifted when he approached groups of men in the evening, the trailing off, the recalibration. He heard it in the way certain jokes landed with a specific quality of mean amusement. He talked to Macready about it. Macready was a practical man who cared about getting his cattle to Pueblo, and he listened to Emmett with the focused attention of someone doing calculations. "You think he's going to be a problem?" "I think he already is," Emmett said. "I think it needs addressing before it becomes something that affects the drive." Macready talked to Vetch. What was said between them Emmett did not know for certain, but he could read the aftermath. Vetch was angry in the coiled, secret way of a man who has been checked but not changed, and that was more dangerous than open hostility. Emmett began sleeping closer to the edge of camp nearest where Catherine had set her bedroll. He did this without announcement. He did not tell her he was doing it. He doubted she would have thanked him for the implication, which was that she needed protecting. She was not a woman who would accept that framing, but he could see both her location and Vetch's location from his new sleeping position, and that was enough for what he needed. He did not examine what it felt like to lie awake on the 4th and 5th and 6th nights in the spring dark of the New Mexico territory, listening to the distant sound of the night herd, and thinking about a woman 20 feet away who had never once, in 6 days of brutal work, asked anyone for anything. On the 7th day, Catherine's horse went lame. It happened in the early afternoon, a wrong step on loose shale that made the bay mare drop her head and pull up short. Catherine was off her back immediately, running her hands down the near foreleg with a focused expression, pressing along the tendons, watching the mare's reaction. The tendon was not bowed, just strained, but strained enough that riding her was out of the question for at least 2 days. She could ride from the remuda. She could pick any of the spare horses, all of them working stock, all of them trail sound. But she had been riding her own mare for years, and the bay knew her the way a horse only knows one person after years of daily work, and Catherine's face, for the first time on the drive, showed something that was not simply neutral efficiency. She showed something that hurt. Emmett saw it. He brought the remuda horses in himself that evening and let her have first choice. She picked a solid Grulla gelding who was steady and experienced, and she ran her hands along his neck and spoke to him quietly in a tone that Emmett, standing close enough to hear without intending to, realized was the same tone she used for everything, low and direct and honest, as if she were telling the horse exactly what was happening and what she needed from him. "You have a way with animals," he said. She looked at him. There was the briefest opening in her face before she assembled the neutral expression again. "My father used to say horses are honest. You know where you stand with them. Meaning people are less honest." She went back to checking the gelding's feet. "Meaning I've found it to be generally true." He sat down on a rock nearby, which was unusual. Emmett Ralston was not a man who sat near people unnecessarily. "Where did you learn to work cattle?" she told him then. "Not everything, not all at once, but enough." Her father, Thomas Sutton, had been a rancher near Cimarron in the Colfax County territory. A stubborn and independent man who had refused to sell out when the Maxwell Land Grant Company began pressuring small operators in the late 1860s. He had paid for that refusal in ways that were dark and sustained and ultimately final. He had died 3 years ago of what the doctor called a heart condition, but what Catherine clearly believed was the slow, comprehensive grinding down of a man who had been fighting an impossible fight for too long. She had inherited the ranch. She had tried to keep it. The land grant pressures had continued, and without her father's tenacity and local connections, she had found herself in a position where continuing to fight would have cost more than she had. She had sold the cattle, sold the land, and found herself 25 years old with a small amount of money, a horse, and the working skills of a person who had grown up doing serious ranch work. "So you drove cattle," Emmett said. "It's what I know," she said simply. "Most women in your position would have found another way." She looked at him again, and this time the expression that moved across her face was complicated. Not offense, not exactly. More like the expression of a person who is perpetually confronted with an assumption they have explained before and have grown tired of explaining. "Most women in my position would have married someone with land," she said. "I tried that once. It did not go as intended." He waited. She seemed to decide something. "I was engaged, a man named Harker. He wanted the ranch more than he wanted me, and he was not particularly subtle about it once the papers started coming from the land company. He sided with them, against my father." She paused. "Against me." Betrayal, Emmett thought. The word landed in his chest with specific weight. He understood something about that, and the understanding made the space between them feel different, denser, more charged with unspoken recognition. "I'm sorry," he said. He did not say it the way people say it when they do not know what else to say. He said it the way a person says it when they mean it simply. She looked at him for a moment longer than she had looked at him before. "You are surprisingly easy to talk to," she said, and the slight surprise in her voice was the most unguarded thing she had shown him. He felt that in a way he was not prepared for. The 10th day brought the river crossing they had been dreading since Santa Fe. The Rio Grande at the Taos crossing had been running high since the spring snowmelt in the mountains, and when the outfit reached the ford in the middle of the afternoon, Emmett studied the current for a long time without speaking. The water was brown and moving fast, not flood stage, but well above normal crossing depth. The ford itself was broad and relatively shallow in dry conditions, but the current was the problem. It was the kind of crossing where you lost cattle. You tried not to lose people. He laid out the plan carefully. The strongest swimmers and most experienced riders would work the upstream flank to prevent the herd from being swept sideways. Briscoe and Emmett himself would take the point and lead the first cattle across. The cattle would follow the leaders if the leaders moved with confidence. Catherine did not volunteer for the upstream flank. She waited. He assigned it to her. She nodded as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The crossing took 4 hours, and it was every bit as brutal as the current had promised. The cattle went into the water herd after herd, the longhorns swimming high with their horns above the water, the current pushing them downstream in long sweeping arcs that the flankers had to ride hard to correct. 2 steers panicked and turned back in the middle, causing a secondary jam that nearly rolled back into the already swimming cattle. Emmett was in the water twice past his stirrups, his horse working hard beneath him, the cold a physical shock each time. He watched the upstream flank working. Catherine was in the water. Her horse was fighting the current and she was letting him fight it without interfering, which was exactly right, exactly the thing an experienced rider does when a horse needs to find its own footing. She was managing two panicked steers simultaneously, one with her rope and one with the pressure of her horse, and she was doing it while the river was trying to push everything she was managing 30 feet downstream. She never went over. She never lost her position. When the last cattle were across and the hands were pulling up on the far bank, wringing water from their hats and counting the herd, she brought her horse up the bank at a walk, checked the cattle near her immediately, confirmed none were lost from her section, and then rode out a little way from the river and sat her horse quietly for a moment. He rode over. She was wet to the waist. Her hat was dripping. There were strands of dark hair plastered to her cheek where they had worked loose from her pins, and she was breathing slowly in the deliberate way of someone managing the aftermath of sustained physical fear. Because it was frightening, that crossing. Only a fool or a liar would say otherwise. "Good work today," he said. She turned to look at him. The careful, neutral expression was still in place, but underneath it something else was working, and he could see it now with the perception that comes from paying close attention to a person for 10 days. She was grateful, not for the compliment alone, but for being seen. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was slightly rough. "For the assignment, for trusting me with the upstream position." "You earned it," he said. This was true. It was a simple statement of fact. But the way it landed between them was not simple, and they both knew it, and neither of them moved away from knowing it. That night at the fire, the dynamic in camp had shifted incrementally in Catherine's direction. Not dramatically, not in the way of sudden conversion, but in the way of men who evaluate people based on demonstrated capacity, and who had now watched her demonstrate it under genuinely hard conditions for 10 consecutive days. Cal Daniels had started deferring to her quietly on questions about cattle handling. Two of the older hands had stopped making the kind of oblique comments that had characterized the early days of the drive. Vetch had not shifted. Vetch sat across the fire from her and watched her with eyes that had taken on the particular quality of someone who has appointed himself the guardian of an injustice and intends to make her feel the weight of it. He had not said anything actionable. He had not done anything that gave Emmett grounds to remove him from the drive. But the intent was there, banked and waiting. Emmett watched Vetch watch Catherine and made a decision. He sat down next to her at the fire. Not across from her, not near her, next to her, close enough that the social message was unmistakable to everyone around the fire. "This woman is under my protection." Not in the way of condescension, but in the way of a trail boss who has decided who belongs in his outfit and will stand behind that decision with his person as well as his authority. She felt him sit down. He saw the slight adjustment of her posture, not pulling away, not leaning in, but registering it, cataloging it the way she cataloged everything. Petey handed them both coffee. They sat together in the fire's warmth, drinking coffee in the spring night, and neither of them said anything for a while, and it was the most comfortable silence Emmett could remember sitting in. The 11th day, she came to him with something she had been carrying alone. It was early morning before the cattle were moved, the camp still half asleep, the sky the deep blue of pre-dawn. She found him at the horse line and she was quieter than usual, which meant something because she was always quiet. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Something that might affect the drive." He listened. She told him that Vetch had come to her bedroll the previous night. He had not touched her. He had crouched down near her in the dark and told her, in a low, steady voice, that she would not finish this drive, that he would see to it, that women who forgot their place found the world had a way of reminding them. He had said it with the particular pleasured conviction of someone who has been planning something. Emmett's jaw tightened. He was quiet for a moment. Did he threaten physical harm? He implied it, she said, the kind of implication that is designed to be denied later. He looked at her. The gray eyes were steady and clear and very, very tired, and the tiredness was not from the drive. It was older than the drive. It was the specific exhaustion of a person who has been fighting something for so long that the fight itself has become background noise. "You should have come to me last night," he said. "I handled it." "How?" "I told him that if he came near me in the dark again, I would break 3 of his fingers before he made another sound." She paused. "He believed me." Emmett looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his chest that was warm and complicated and very much not the appropriate professional response of a trail boss managing a personnel problem. "You still should have told me. I'm telling you now. Because you want me to handle it." "Because," she said carefully, "I think you have the right to know what is happening in your own outfit, and because I would rather not be alone in this if there is someone trustworthy." He heard what she was really saying. She had decided he was trustworthy. From a woman who had been betrayed by someone she loved and then spent 3 years being the only person she could count on, the word trustworthy landed with the weight of something much larger. He removed Vetch from the drive that morning. It was not a dramatic event. He told Macready what had happened, and Macready agreed without hesitation, because Macready was a practical man, and a threat to a member of the outfit was a threat to the outfit. Vetch was paid for his days, given his horse, and told to ride south. He made noise about it, the hard, entitled noise of a man who cannot understand why his particular brand of menace is not simply accepted as part of the landscape. Emmett listened to the noise without expression. Then Vetch rode south and the drive went north, and the sky was very large and very blue above the New Mexico territory. Catherine watched Vetch ride away from a distance, and her face showed nothing. But when she turned her horse north and went back to her flank, there was something in the way she sat the saddle that was marginally, fractionally less rigid than it had been for 11 days. He noticed that too. The days that followed had a different quality, not easier exactly. The terrain north of Taos was rough. The cattle were trail-weary and increasingly cantankerous. Old Petey had developed a bad cough from the river crossing that worried everyone, and the weather turned on the 14th day into a cold, rattling rain that came in sideways off the mountains and made every hour in the saddle a particular variety of misery. But the camp had settled. The hands had coalesced around the understanding that Emmett had established, which was that Catherine was a full member of the outfit, full stop. And the kind of men who remained on the drive were the kind of men who could accept that reality without requiring ongoing negotiation about it. Cal and Webb Daniels had become something like her unofficial deputies on the right flank, following her read on the cattle with the trust of young men who understood they were learning from someone better. And Emmett and Catherine had begun talking, really talking, not the brief functional exchanges of the first 10 days, but the longer conversations that open up between people who have passed through difficulty together and discovered that the other person handles difficulty in a way they respect. They talked in the evenings mostly, after the cattle were settled and the camp was quiet, in the space between Petey's fire and the horse line where neither of them was quite visible to the rest of the outfit. She told him about Cimarron, about her father, who had been a complicated man, principled and stubborn and loving in the way of people who express love through expectation rather than tenderness. About her mother, who had died when Catherine was 12, of fever, and how after that she had become both daughter and ranch hand, and the person who held the domestic life of the ranch together while also learning everything her father knew about cattle. He told her, in return and slowly, about things he had not told many people, about his own childhood in East Texas, which had been poor and unsentimental, and had equipped him with the skills of self-sufficiency without giving him much practice in softness. About the year he had spent drifting after his first big drive went wrong, not because of anything dramatic, but because he had lost the compass he had been using to navigate his life and needed to find another one. About the way trail work had given him purpose, the clean daily equation of it, The problem always clear and the solution always physical and the result always measurable. "You are afraid of stillness," she said one evening. He looked at her. "What do you mean? When there is nothing to solve, nothing to manage, you become uncomfortable. I have watched you for 2 weeks. When the cattle are settled and the camp is right and there is nothing that requires your attention, you find something to check, something to fix. You cannot be still." He was quiet for a long time. "You are observant," he said finally. "You notice everything about the people in your outfit," she said. "You do not think I would notice the same things about you." "What else have you noticed?" She looked at him across the small space between them. The fire was far enough behind them that the light was low, and the stars over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains were extraordinary, the way they are in that altitude and that season, close and numerous and without mercy in their beauty. "I have noticed," she said, "that you are the first person since my father who made me feel like my competence was something to be respected rather than explained or apologized for." He did not answer immediately. What she had said was the kind of honest that costs something, and he wanted to honor it by not rushing his response. "Your competence does not need explaining," he said. "I've been doing this 15 years. I know what good looks like." "You are very good." "That is not what I mean," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "I know what you mean." The fire crackled behind them. Somewhere in the dark a coyote called. The cattle moved in the black distance, a low collective sound of animals at rest. "I should sleep," she said. "Catherine," she stopped. She had been beginning to rise, and she stopped, and she did not turn around immediately, as if she were deciding whether turning around was wise. He had not used her first name before. He had not used anyone's first name without it being earned, and she heard the difference and she knew what it meant. She turned around. He was looking at her with the direct, unguarded expression that he almost never wore, the expression that was underneath all the cataloging and management, the face of a man who has recognized something in another person that he did not know he was looking for. "I want you to know," he said, "that whatever happens at the end of this drive, what you have done on this drive is real. Nobody can take that from you." She understood that he was giving her something permanent, something she could carry forward beyond the temporary context of the drive and the outfit and the particular 340 miles of New Mexico and Colorado territory they were crossing together. He was saying, "You are real, your capacity is real, and I see it." Her face did something he had never seen it do. It opened. Just briefly, just enough for him to see the person behind all the endurance and the practicality and the refusal to complain. And what he saw there was someone who had been waiting a long time to be seen without needing to justify the seeing. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was very quiet. Then she went to her bedroll, and he sat alone in the dark with the stars overhead and the full weight of what he was feeling landing on him all at once, which was that he was in serious trouble of the best possible kind. The 15th day brought an emergency that had nothing to do with cattle. Old Petey collapsed at the breakfast fire. He had been sick for 4 days with the cough from the river crossing, but had refused to acknowledge it beyond a few dismissive comments about his constitution being made of tougher material than whatever New Mexico rivers were offering. When he went down, it was suddenly and completely, and the camp moved around him in a kind of organized alarm. He was breathing, conscious but burning with fever, and clearly not in any condition to continue. The nearest town was a small settlement called Rayado, roughly 8 miles west of their current position. They needed someone to take Petey to Rayado and see him into the care of whatever medical help was available, and then rejoin the drive. Catherine was already mixing something. She had, apparently, a small medical kit in her saddlebag. Emmett had not known this. She produced it with the calm purposefulness of someone who carries it because they have needed it, and she was mixing willow bark into water and speaking to Petey in that low, honest voice she used for horses and frightened men and, apparently, sick old cooks. She got the willow bark tea into him and got his fever to stop climbing, and then she looked up at Emmett and said, "He needs a doctor and he needs rest." Two of his ribs feel wrong on the right side. I think the coughing may have cracked them. Emmett organized it. Briscoe and Cal Daniels took Petey to Rayado on a travois rigged between two horses, leaving the drive short a cook, which was its own problem. They managed on cold provisions for 2 days, Briscoe and Cal rejoining the drive on the second morning with the news that Petey was in the care of a local woman who had experience with illness and that he would live. He would not be rejoining the drive. The cooking problem was solved the way most problems on a cattle drive are solved, which is by whoever is there doing whatever needs to be done. Catherine cooked that night without making any announcement about it, simply started on the beans and the cornbread and the coffee with the same efficient attention she gave to everything else, and the men ate well and did not comment on it, which was a form of acceptance that mattered. The night of the 15th day, Emmett came to where she was cleaning up after the meal and stood near her without speaking for a while. She looked at him sideways. "Say what you are going to say." "I'm going to need you to take on the cooking until we reach Pueblo," he said. "In addition to your riding duties, I can reduce your saddle time on easier days but not on the difficult ones." "I can do both," she said. "It is too much for one person." "I said I can do both," she repeated, but there was no sharpness in it. It was simply the flat certainty he had come to associate with her, the statement of a person who has correctly evaluated a problem and given an accurate answer. He looked at her. "Why?" She set down the pot she was washing and turned to face him fully. "Because I am here and Petey is not and people need to eat. Is that not enough reason?" "Most people would argue for fewer responsibilities." "I am not most people," she said. He almost smiled. He was not a man who smiled easily, but something at the corner of his mouth moved in a way that altered his whole face, and she saw it, and her own expression shifted subtly in response, a warmth under the gray eyes that was new. "No," he said, "you are definitely not." The 17th day was the day Vetch came back. He did not come back alone. He came back with 2 men, strangers to the drive, who rode horses that had not been on the trail and wore guns that were worn low in the way of men who thought of guns as tools rather than accessories. They appeared at the edge of the evening camp just as the cattle were being settled, at the hour when the light is failing and shapes are ambiguous, and the hard edge of the working day has given way to the vulnerable soft time of supper and rest. Emmett saw them first. He saw them, and he understood the shape of what this was, which was that Vetch had nursed his resentment for 6 days and had decided that authority was not the only lever available to him in this situation. He walked toward them with his hand not on his gun but near it, and the conversation that followed was brief and controlled. Vetch wanted his job back. His friends were present to underline that want with physical emphasis. Emmett told Vetch that there was nothing for him here and that the choice he was making would follow him. Vetch's face was ugly with something that was beyond simple anger. It was the specific rage of a man who has assigned the cause of all his failures to one person and believes that removing that person will resolve the failures. His eyes moved to Catherine, who had come to stand at Emmett's left shoulder because she had seen them arrive, and she was not a woman who let other people fight her battles without her presence. "She shouldn't be here," Vetch said. "Everything wrong about this drive starts with her." "Everything wrong about this drive started with you," Emmett said without heat. "Ride away, Dolan, while the choice is still yours to make." Vetch stared at him, then looked at Catherine, then looked at Emmett again and saw something in Emmett's face that had not been there the last time they had spoken, a specific quality of stillness that very dangerous men have when they are absolutely certain of their next action and are merely waiting for the other party to make the decision that triggers it. Vetch turned his horse around. His 2 companions, who had not been paid enough for whatever this was becoming, followed without argument. The drive stood in the evening dust and watched them go. Catherine, standing at Emmett's left shoulder, said quietly and only to him, "That is not over." "No," he agreed, "but it is over for tonight." She looked at him, and their eyes held for a moment that was longer than purely practical, And then the cattle shifted and the camp required its attention, and they both moved back to their respective tasks. But the moment stayed with him. The particular way she had stood at his shoulder, not behind him, not in front of him, but beside him, which was exactly where she positioned herself in every other context too. He thought about that as he made his rounds that night. He thought about it until he stopped pretending he was thinking about it professionally and admitted to himself what he was actually thinking about. The 18th day, the river encounter, which is where this story began. The shot that Vetch fired at Catherine that evening by the river went wide by 6 feet, which meant it was meant to frighten rather than kill. But that distinction felt academic when the gun went off, and the world compressed into a single vivid second. When Emmett stepped between the gun and Catherine, and Vetch lowered the weapon, what followed was quick and grim and complete. Macready arrived at a run from the camp. 2 other hands flanked Vetch from either side. Vetch was disarmed, and his companions, who had apparently followed the drive at a distance, were apprehended near the tree line where they had been waiting. Macready, who was not a violent man but was a resolute one, had a conversation with the 3 of them that Emmett was present for and Catherine was not. The substance of it was that if any of them came within 5 miles of the drive again, Macready would send a rider to the nearest federal marshal with a very specific account of events, and that the New Mexico Territory courts were not known for their lenience with men who fired guns at drive employees. It was not a poetic speech. It was effective. Vetch and his companions rode away and did not return. Emmett found Catherine after, sitting on a rock above the river where the last light was still pink on the water. She was very still, the way she was still after the river crossing, the stillness of someone running through something difficult internally until they could place it in its proper context. He sat down beside her on the rock. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No, Catherine. I am not hurt," she said again. Then after a moment, "I am angry." "That's fair. I am angry," she said, with more precision, "because I have worked as hard as any person on this drive. I have not asked for anything that was not given to every other hand. I have done the job that was asked of me and a great deal more, and I am still fighting the same fight that I have been fighting my entire adult life, which is simply the right to exist in the work I know how to do without being treated as an affront." He listened. "My father fought the land company for years because they decided his ownership was an inconvenience to their plans. He did everything right. He held clear title. He paid his debts. He was a better rancher than any of the company's managers. It did not matter. They ground him down because they had decided that the outcome they wanted was more important than the rules everyone else was supposed to follow." She paused. "Vetch is smaller than that, but the principle is the same. People who want power decide that your claim to dignity is inconvenient and try to remove it." Emmett sat with this for a long time. The river ran below them, dark and indifferent and lovely. "I cannot fix what happened to your father," he said. "I cannot fix the system that let men like Vetch think that what he did was acceptable. I can only tell you what I see when I look at you. I see someone whose right to be here is so obvious and so thoroughly demonstrated that any argument against it is an argument against evidence and sense." She turned to look at him. The anger was still in her face, but something else was moving through it now, something that was making her eyes very bright. "Why do you see that?" she asked. "Most men see what they expect to see." "I learned early," he said slowly, "that seeing what is actually in front of you rather than what you expect is the only way to stay alive in this work. The cattle do not care what you expect them to do. The weather does not care. If you are not paying attention to what is real, what is actually happening, you get hurt." He paused. "I have been paying attention to you since the first morning." The river made its sound below them. "Emmett," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name, and the way she said it was quiet and deliberate and meant something specific. He looked at her. "I do not know what happens at the end of this drive," she said. "I have no plans beyond Pueblo because my plans have been one drive at a time since I sold the ranch. But I want you to know that whatever does happen the past 3 weeks knowing you, has been the first time in a long time that I have felt like myself again. Not the version of myself that is only endurance, the whole version." He reached over and took her hand. He did it slowly, giving her every opportunity to make a different choice, because she was a woman who had had choices taken from her, and he would not be another person who moved faster than her consent. But she turned her hand in his and held it, and they sat on the rock above the river as the last light left the sky, and neither of them said anything else for a while because nothing else needed to be said yet. The final 2 days of the drive to Pueblo had a quality that was different from everything before. Not easier. The cattle were as difficult as cattle always are in the final miles before a delivery, sensing the compression of space and the proximity of strange smells from the pens at the railhead. And the hands were tired in the deep bone-tired way of people who have been working at capacity for 3 weeks. But something had opened up in the atmosphere of the drive, some release of long-held tension, and even the most skeptical of the remaining hands had arrived at a kind of equilibrium about Catherine Sutton that looked, in the end, like simple respect. Emmett and Catherine rode point together on the final day. This was unusual. Point was Emmett's position, and he typically took it with Briscoe. But he wanted her there at the front, leading the herd into Pueblo, because she had earned it in every specific and demonstrable way, and because he wanted her to have that moment. The Hargrove buyer met them at the pens outside Pueblo on a cool, clear morning in late April, and the handshake and the cattle count and the exchange of money happened with the businesslike efficiency of men who do this regularly. Macready was pleased. The count was within the expected loss range for a drive of this distance, which was a success by any standard. When Macready paid out the hands, he came to Catherine last, and he handed her the same wage as every other hand, and he said, with the gruff directness of a man who finds emotional acknowledgement physically uncomfortable, "You did the work, Miss Sutton. I would hire you on my next drive if you wanted it." She took the money. "Thank you, Mr. Macready," she said. "You should thank Ralston," Macready said. "He's the one that told me to hire you." She looked at Emmett. Emmett looked at the far mountains. "Is that so?" she said. "He was right," Macready said, and went off to count his money. The outfit dispersed over the following hours in the way of drives concluded, men going their various directions with their pay in their pockets, and the particular looseness of people released from the sustained discipline of the trail. Cal and Webb Daniels shook Catherine's hand with genuine warmth. Briscoe, who was not a demonstrative man, told her she was a credit to the trade. Others nodded or waved or simply rode away. Catherine came to where Emmett was seeing to his horse at the livery. "You told Macready to hire me," she said. "He was making the right decision anyway," Emmett said, without looking up from the buckle he was working. "I just pointed it out. You advocated for me when you had no basis for the advocacy. You had never seen me work." He looked up then. "I could see you work. You were right there in front of me. You had known me for 10 minutes. 15, he said. "And some people you can read in 15 minutes if you know what to look for." She studied him. The gray eyes were very direct. "What did you read?" He set down the bridle and turned to face her fully. Someone who was exactly what she said she was. No more performance than necessary, no apology for her own existence, no hidden motive. Just a person who wanted to do the work she was qualified for. He paused. "That is rarer than it should be." "Hidden motives," she said softly. "You have been thinking about that." "I think about a lot of things when I am supposed to be sleeping," he said. The space between them was small. The livery smelled of hay and horse and dust, and the sounds of Pueblo came in from the street outside, and it was all very ordinary and very loud with what neither of them had said yet. "I have nowhere to be," she said carefully. "After today, I mean. My plan was to finish the drive and then make another plan." "I know," he said. "I want to know what you are going to do," she said. "After today." He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man who is uncertain, but the quiet of a man assembling something true. "Macready has another drive in the fall," he said, 5 months away. I had been planning to spend those 5 months in Colorado, pick up work where I could find it, maybe look at some land. He paused. "I have been thinking about land, about settling." Settling, she repeated. I have been thinking about it for a while, he said. But a person sitting alone on a piece of land is less appealing to me than it was a month ago. She was very still. Catherine, he said, and her name in his mouth was the same quiet deliberateness it had been at the river, weighted with intention. I am not a man who says things he doesn't mean, and I am not a man who moves faster than is right. But I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that the answer you give will not change what I think of you or what I said about your work. Those things are separate. Ask, she said. Would you be willing to see what this could be? Not on a drive, not in the particular extraordinary conditions that make a drive its own world, but here in ordinary time with ordinary days. He paused. I would like to know you outside of a cattle drive. She let out a slow breath. You have just described the thing I have been afraid of, she said. What thing? Wanting something normal. I have been moving since I sold the ranch. Always the next job, the next season. Moving is safer than wanting. She met his eyes. But I am tired of safe. He reached out and touched her face, his thumb along her jaw, the first time he had touched her that way, and she held very still under the touch and then leaned into it just slightly, which was one of the most honest and specific things he had ever seen a person do. There is land northwest of here, he said, near the Spanish Peaks. I have been asking about it. Good grass, good water, manageable terrain for cattle. You have been asking about land, she said. For a few weeks now, he admitted. She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her doing what she did when she was solving something, the quick internal assessment, the weighing of evidence, the honest reading of what was real and what was wishful. Then the assessment resolved in her face, and what replaced it was something warm and deeply sure. Show me, she said. They rode to the Spanish Peaks country in May, Emmett and Catherine, which was to say that they rode north and west of Pueblo into the high country, where the twin volcanic peaks stood against the sky like something permanent, had been established in the landscape, to give reference to everything that was not. The land they found was everything Emmett had described, a broad valley with a creek running through it, grassland that stretched to tree-covered slopes to the west, the kind of land that made a person understand immediately what had drawn people to this country. They camped on it for 3 days while they talked about what it meant and what it would require. The talking was different from the talking on the drive. On the drive, the conversation had been shaped by the urgency of the work and the constant need to be somewhere else. Now there was nothing they needed to do except be present, and Emmett found that the stillness he usually could not tolerate was, with Catherine sitting across from him in the firelight, not stillness at all. It was full. She told him more about Cimarron, about her father in the fuller and more complicated version that had been waiting behind the condensed drive camp version, the ways she had loved him and the ways he had failed her, the grief that was still an ongoing conversation she was having with a person who was no longer there to receive it. He listened to all of it. He told her about a woman he had loved briefly and badly when he was 23, the dark past of it, the part where she had left for someone with more money and fewer calluses on his hands, and how it had confirmed in him a suspicion that what he had to offer was not the kind of thing people wanted. He had carried that for 8 years. That is wrong, she said, without hesitation. Which part? The conclusion you drew from it. What you have to offer is not defined by what one person wanted in one set of circumstances. She said it with the flat certainty that was her register for true things. What you have to offer is what I have seen for 3 weeks: fairness, competence. The capacity to see people as they are, those are not small things. He looked at her across the fire. Marry me, he said. She blinked. I know that is very fast, he said. It is extremely fast, she agreed, and her voice had the very slight warmth in it that was her version of laughter. We have known each other for 4 weeks. 3 weeks on the drive and 1 week here, he said. And I know what I know. What do you know? That I have been looking for someone like you for my entire adult life, without understanding what I was looking for until I found it. That the kind of person who gets through 3 weeks of a cattle drive without complaint, who does not adjust their principles under pressure, who stands at your shoulder rather than behind it when there is trouble, that is the kind of person you want beside you for the rest of your life. He paused. I want to buy this land with you. I want to build something on it. I want to know what kind of ranch we could make with both of us working on it. She was quiet for a long time. The Spanish peak stood in the moonlight, enormous and old and enduring. I need you to understand something, she said finally. I will not be a ranch wife who stays inside. I will work the cattle with you. I will have opinions about the decisions we make and I will say them. I will not be managed. I would be deeply disappointed if you were any of those things, he said, and I will not go back to being someone whose competence is a source of embarrassment for the man she is with. Catherine, he said, with a kind of patient certainty, I fell in love with your competence before I fell in love with anything else. That is not something I would want to diminish any more than I would want to diminish my own ability to work. She looked at him. The gray eyes were very full. Then yes, she said, ask me properly. He got up from where he was sitting and crouched in front of her, and he took both her hands and he said, Catherine Sutton, will you marry me? Yes, she said. Emmett Ralston, I will. He kissed her for the first time then, in the Spanish Peaks Valley, with the fire behind them and the mountains above them, and the sound of their horses on the grass, the only sound in all that enormous country. And the kiss was exactly like Catherine herself, honest and direct and without performance, and it was the finest thing he had ever experienced. They were married in Pueblo in June of 1873, in the small church on the main street, with Macready standing as a witness and Cal and Webb Daniels in attendance, because they happened to be in town, and Catherine had come to regard Cal in particular as something like a little brother. The ceremony was brief and practical and genuine in the way that things Catherine Sutton was involved in always were. Macready shook Emmett's hand after and said, Best hire I ever made, without specifying whether he meant Catherine or the decision to listen to Emmett. Webb Daniels told Catherine she looked beautiful, which she did, in a blue dress that was the color of the sky above the Sangre de Cristos, and Catherine thanked him with the warmth she reserved for people she had come to genuinely love. Emmett looked at her across the small churchyard and thought. She was the most extraordinary person he had ever met, and she had agreed to spend her life building something with him, and he was going to be grateful for that fact every day for the rest of his life. They went back to the valley. The land purchase was finalized in July with the assistance of a land agent in Pueblo who was efficient and reasonably honest. They paid what the land required and signed the papers, and Emmett stood in the valley with the deed in his hand and looked at Catherine and said, Ours. She looked at the valley, the creek and the grass and the mountains, and she said, Ours, back to him. And her voice on the word was so different from the voice she had used for practical things on the drive. It was open and certain and very much not a woman who was only enduring. The building of the ranch was the work of two people who understood work. They built the house first, a log and adobe structure with 2 rooms and a proper fireplace, Emmett doing the heavy timber work and Catherine managing the chinking, and the finishing with the same precise attention she brought to everything. They built it in 2 months, which was fast, but they worked from first light to last light with the focused pleasure of people who know what they are building toward. In the autumn, Emmett rode the Macready Drive as trail boss one final time, because they needed the income and because he had given his word, and Catherine managed the ranch in his absence with such thoroughness that, when he returned in November, the cattle they had acquired were well settled. The fodder was cut and stored, and she had begun the groundwork for a second corral. He walked in from the trail to find her at the fire, and she looked up at him with the warmth in her gray eyes that was her version of everything most people expressed loudly, and he sat down across from her and said, Tell me everything I missed. She told him. All of it, the practical and the occasional, and the one morning when a bear had come down from the mountain slopes, and she had driven it off with the rifle she kept above the door, and the strong opinion that bears were very large and she was glad there was only one of them. He listened to all of it with the specific pleasure of a person receiving exactly what they want most, which was her voice telling him true things. She was pregnant by January of 1874. She told him early in the morning while he was still only half awake, sitting up in the bed with the January cold pressing against the windows, and she said it in her direct way with the slight held-breath quality of a person delivering news whose reception they care about. "Emmett, I am going to have a child." He sat up fully. He looked at her face, the enormous composed gray eyes and the slight held breath, and he felt something happen in his chest that was so large it was difficult to contain. He reached for her hands. "Are you well?" he asked first. She exhaled. "Yes, I am very well." "Are you frightened?" She considered this with her characteristic honesty. "A little, mostly I am glad." She paused. "Are you glad?" He brought her hands up and pressed his face against them for a moment in a gesture that was private and total, and when he looked up his eyes were full of a feeling that he had almost never let show. "I am so glad," he said simply. "Catherine, I am so glad." She came into his arms then, the most fully she had ever let herself be held, and they sat together in the January morning with the fire warming the log walls, and the Spanish Peak stood outside white with snow against a blue sky, and it was entirely all right. Their son was born in October of 1874, a healthy and large-voiced baby they named Thomas William Ralston. Thomas for Catherine's father and William for Emmett's older brother who had died young. He arrived with the determined energy of a person who has somewhere to be and refused to be a simple delivery, taking a full day and wearing Catherine to an extraordinary depth of exhaustion. And when it was over, she held Thomas in her arms with the look of someone who has passed through the hardest thing and come out the other side changed. Emmett sat beside the bed and held her hand and watched his wife hold his son, and the feeling that moved through him then had no name that existed in the language he had grown up with, the language of practical men in a practical country. But it was real and it was specific, and it took up permanent residence in him. Thomas William Ralston grew into an energetic and curious child who was, as Emmett noted at regular intervals, exactly like his mother in every specific that mattered. He was observant and direct, and absorbed new information with the quick thoroughness of a person who does not like to work without knowing the reason for the work. He rode before he was 4, which was not unusual in that country and that time, but the ease with which he sat a horse made Catherine laugh the first time she saw it. The ranch grew. Not dramatically, not in the way of the great cattle empires further south and east, but steadily and soundly, which was Catherine's preferred mode of all things. By 1876 they had 300 head and a reliable arrangement with a buyer in Pueblo. By 1877 they had built a second outbuilding and hired their first hand, a taciturn and experienced man named Hector Valesques who had come up from the territory, and who showed an immediate and evident respect for Catherine's authority over the cattle that Emmett privately found deeply satisfying. In 1876, Catherine had a second child, a daughter they named Margaret Ann, who arrived more easily than Thomas and who was from the beginning a person of decided opinions and significant volume, both of which Catherine regarded with the expression of someone recognizing their own qualities in a new configuration. Emmett, who had spent his entire adult life in a country that never let him be still, found that standing in his doorway in the evening watching his wife and his children in the last light of a Spanish Peak sunset was the most complete stillness he had ever known. Not the empty stillness of a man with nothing to solve, but the full stillness of a man who has solved the most important thing and is present to the result. One evening in the spring of 1877, they were sitting on the porch Emmett had built the previous fall, Thomas asleep inside and Margaret making the small sounds of a baby not yet ready to surrender to sleep, and the valley was gold and green in the late light, the creek making its constant sound. Catherine was quiet for a while, which was not unusual. Then she said, "I used to think the worst thing that could happen was having to sell the Cimarron Ranch. It felt like the end of everything I had been given. "And now?" he asked. She looked at the valley. Her valley, their valley, the Spanish peaks rising above it in the permanent way of things that are older than any human story. "Now I understand that it was the beginning," she said. "The end of the version of me that was only enduring and the beginning of the version that gets to also have this." She gestured at the valley, at the house, but also at him, including him in the gesture with the directness she had always had. He reached over and took her hand. "You were always going to get here," he said. "You were always going to survive the enduring and come out on the other side." "I might not have," she said honestly. "People do not always make it through." "You would have," he said, with the certainty of a man who had watched her cross a flooded river and face a gun and drive cattle in every condition the New Mexico territory could produce. "You would have, because it is who you are." She turned and looked at him with the full open look she had learned to give him, the look that was not defended or neutralized, the look of a woman who had been seen so thoroughly, and for so long that there was no longer any reason to hide. "I love you," she said. It was simple and direct and exactly like her. "I love you," he said back in the same way. The spring evening held them on the porch with the sound of the creek and the distant mountains and a baby working herself toward sleep, and the valley spread below them in all its ordinary, extraordinary beauty, and it was exactly enough. The years that followed built on what they had started the way a well-made thing accretes strength over time, not dramatically but durably. Emmett stopped taking drives in 1878 when the ranch reached a size that required his full attention, and when, honestly, the idea of leaving Catherine and the children for 3 months at a stretch had become something his constitution refused to endorse. He hired 2 more hands, both experienced, both capable, and he built the ranch into a self-sustaining operation of 500 head by 1880. Catherine ran the breeding program with the focused intelligence she brought to all complex systems, tracking lineages and outcomes with a record-keeping discipline that other ranchers in the Spanish Peaks country came to consult, which was a thing that still surprised some of them, to find that the person with the most sophisticated cattle knowledge in the valley was the woman who had arrived there off a cattle drive 7 years earlier. Catherine herself found their surprise unremarkable. She was accustomed to being underestimated on first meeting and surpassing expectations by second. Thomas, at 6, was her constant companion when she worked the cattle, riding beside her with the serious attention of a boy who has decided that the way his mother moves through work is the correct model, and he intends to learn it. Emmett watched this and said nothing, because watching Catherine teach their son to read cattle and rope and manage horses was one of the pure pleasures of his life, and he was not going to interfere with it by making commentary. Margaret, at 4, had decided that she was in charge of all opinions, and that the ranch would benefit from regular comprehensive assessment of everything that was happening on it, a quality that made Emmett laugh with a depth and frequency that continued to surprise him, because he had not been a man who laughed much before. In 1880, Cal Daniels, the young man who had been on his first drive the year they met, passed through the Spanish Peaks country on his way further north and stopped at the ranch. He was 27 now, no longer the wide-eyed young hand who had watched Catherine stop a stampede at an arroyo, but still recognizably himself, good-natured and direct and clearly doing well. He sat at their table and ate Catherine's cooking and listened to Thomas and Margaret compete for his attention, and looked around at the ranch with an expression that was openly happy on their behalf. "I told people about you," he said to Catherine, "on the drives I did after. When they would say a thing like women cannot do this work, I told them about the drive in 73. About you." He paused. "I hope you don't mind." "What did you tell them?" she asked. "I told them the truth," he said. "That you were the best hand on the drive and you finished every single day without complaint, and by the 3rd day Emmett Ralston couldn't take his eyes off you." He grinned at Emmett, which everyone found very impressive. Emmett, who was drinking coffee, managed not to express his feelings about this characterization with his face, but only barely. Catherine looked at Emmett with the warmth and the slight opening at the corner of her mouth that was her laughter and said, "Is that accurate?" "The part about the work is accurate," Emmett said, "and the other part—" He looked at her across the table, this woman who had ridden into a staging camp in Santa Fe in 1873, and asked for a job with the flat certainty of someone who has already decided what the answer will be. This woman who had crossed a river and faced a gun and built a ranch with him and given him 2 children and the full rich life of a person who has found exactly what they were meant to be doing and with whom. And he said, "The other part is also accurate." Cal Daniels laughed. Thomas Ralston, age 6, looked at his father with the analytical expression of someone who is adding this new information to his understanding of how things work. Margaret Ralston, age 4, announced that she was hungry. Catherine got up to get more food, and as she passed behind Emmett's chair she put her hand briefly on his shoulder, the most ordinary possible gesture, the kind that belongs to people who have been through everything together and are still, on the other side of it all, glad to be there. He put his hand over hers for a moment. Outside, the Spanish peaks stood against the Colorado sky in the long, permanent way of things that are there before you and will be there after, and the valley ran green and gold in the spring afternoon, and the creek made its constant sound, and the ranch that 2 people had built from a cattle drive and a deed and the willingness to see each other clearly was fully and completely alive with everything that had grown from those beginnings. The story of Catherine Sutton and Emmett Ralston, which was the story of a woman who had ridden into an impossible situation and finished every single day without complaint, had arrived at the place where all real love stories arrive, not at the dramatic moment of recognition, not at the crisis, not even at the vow, but here, in the ordinary long afternoon of a life built well, with the particular satisfaction of people who built it together and who knew. In the way that knowing settles deep into the bones that what they had was the real and enduring thing. It was enough. It was everything.